These are my 3 steps to start improving site speed ASAP. Number 1, measure my current page performance. Number 2, I'm going to knock out easy wins in my site code. And number 3, I'm going to review my hosting provider. So I'll dive into details for each step. I'm going to list out some tools I like to use, some techniques I use to spot improvements, and how I evaluate different hosting providers when I'm thinking about maximizing my page performance. So I'll be sure to drop the timestamps for each of these sections below in the description. But before we dive in, just a quick question. Does site performance actually matter? If you're watching this video, I'm going to assume you already know the answer to this question. But just so we're all on the same page, performance does matter. And here are some testimonials from some of the large companies. So obviously Google, they ran this experiment. The page with 10 results took 0.4 seconds to generate. The page with 30 results took 0.9 seconds. So half a second delay caused almost a 20% drop in traffic. So what would your business do if you had 20% more traffic just by optimizing performance? Another situation at Amazon, they were doing A/B testing and they were delaying the page by increments of 100 milliseconds. Every small 100 millisecond delay substantially dropped revenue. And then lastly, we have this Forrester report here. The CTO of a media organization said that a site with hundreds of thousands of pages, only 2 or 3% of them were ranking well in search engines. Pages took seconds to load, and most search engine algorithms factor in web performance. So yes, it matters. Users do care about performance. And if I serve a slow site to my customers, to my users, they are A, probably not seeing it in search results, and then B, leaving frustrated and going to my competitor because they're stuck on a loading spinner. So let's actually start diving into how I optimize performance. The first step is measuring my site. What gets measured gets managed, but what are we measuring here? So this is where Google's core web vitals come into play, these CWVs. We got to measure our site to understand what to actually fix. And Google is kind of listing out these 3 metrics as what they're optimizing for their users. So these are the 3 core metrics. We have LCP, which is largest contentful paint. This answers a question: how quickly does that main image or video take to load? Think of it as your hero image when you go to your website, the first image that shows up, that background video, that background image. This is what LCP is asking. INP, interaction to next paint. This answers a question: how quickly does your site respond to users' input? Now, this is a really new metric. This was added in April 2024 of earlier this year. This replaces that first input delay metric, so this is another thing to look out for. Cumulative layout shift. This answers the question of, does the layout shift unexpectedly as elements load? Sometimes, maybe I'd say lazy developers will do almost 2 websites so that you have this default experience that loads. It's got a bunch of skeletons, things aren't loaded in, and then everything pops in and the page changes. This is what cumulative layout shift is. So there are other useful metrics for measuring site performance. Time to first byte. We can look at FID as well, but for the sake of this video, let's just keep the focus on these 3 here. So some tools I actually use to measure performance, and this is where we kind of get into the details here. Something important to note: websites are not discrete, static things. Websites change, mutate based on when you access them, how you access them, if you've interacted with the site before. Like, for example, CDNs, content delivery networks, can drastically change subsequent site visits and make them load like nearly instantaneously because it's coming from a cache that's super close to your user. Or it can be excruciatingly slow if the user is somewhere super far away from your main servers or is loading their site up through a mobile device, which has just less bandwidth and less CPU. It's extremely flexible, and it's just kind of a spectrum of performance for a given website. So when it comes to measuring a site, answering the question of how well is our site actually performing, we need to capture that fullest sense of performance. We're going to measure synthetic performance, real user metrics, and look at timelines. So starting first with timeline, this is probably the easiest to go over. I want to see how my site loads over time, ideally compared to my competitors. So this app right here, Lightus.app, and all these tools I'll link in the description below. This is the best I've seen so far for getting a quick overview. We see here this example of a bunch of different banking websites. Now, if you take a look here, obviously like Chase.com is coming back the quickest with some type of response, but we have that cumulative layout shift where we have some type of data and then everything kind of pops in. And then the last obviously is going to be US Bank here. It just takes the longest to get back with anything. And so this is a good gut check. If we have 3 or 4 competitors in mind, are we out competing them on performance? This is a great gut check to see that in one whole view. Synthetic metrics, now these are interesting. This is performance metrics that are done on a machine. meaning not on a real user's machine. This is an important distinction because this isn't what your users are actually experiencing. This is just kind of us benchmarking our performance. So good metrics to have. These are some tools I like to use here. So Lighthouse, we got to start with this. This is the tool that Chrome gives out. This is what Google gives out. Gives me those classic performance rating circles like we've seen here before. You'll access this via the Chrome Inspect tool. You'll go to the Lighthouse tab, and do note, these metrics are extremely deceptive because they run off of your machine. So if you're on like the most souped up MacBook Pro with super fast internet, your performance may be deceptively high. And so if you're hiring an agency or someone's giving you these metrics, trust but verify. Just make sure that we're not playing with these numbers. And I've actually seen a tweet where an agency was actually adding custom code to just spoof these numbers when they came up. Dirty stuff. So you can get close, even if you're on the most souped up Mac. We can get very close to what your mobile users are experiencing if you throttle your own network speed using the same Chrome Inspect tool. So they actually expose this. If you go into the Inspect tool, right-click Inspect. See they're here, right? If you click on that, you click on those three dots, you go to More Tools, Network Conditions. You'll see network throttling here. You can toggle that to fast 3G, and you'll be kind of similar to what mobile users are experiencing. The next tool I'm going to go over is PageSpeed.webdev. This is another free tool. It gives another view of that Lighthouse report. This one's done on Google's machines. This is another tool that they provide that's external. So you're not using your own computers to actually measure this. It just gives another view of that same kind of Lighthouse report. And we can see the metrics are kind of showing up here as well. The next thing, now we're getting into a little bit more advanced stuff. This is Sitespeed.io plus Grafana for graphing. This is free, but it requires extensive coding knowledge. This is another synthetic testing tool, but I'm able to set up constant monitoring to track changes over time. This is something we can't do with Lighthouse or with PageSpeed because we're just kind of pulse checking manually every now and then. Websites aren't static, so tracking changes over time like this, like having a graph where we're actually able to see the synthetic metrics, is extremely useful because we're constantly changing content on the page, adding content, removing things, making updates. So this gives us that overview holistically of it over time, which is extremely useful. Now, it does require setup. So I have here also Treo.sh. This is a paid tool. It's very similar to Sitespeed, but it gives us lots of pre-configured dashboards. This shows great charts for speed across the globe. We can track it over time. You see here we have February. We can jump in and out of different months. And it reports it across all the pages as well. So another really good tool to have in our back pocket. It is paid. So the kind of through line here is you need some coding experience regardless because it opens up a lot more doors. But there are ways to come around it if you do have a little bit of a budget. And next is Speed Curve. This is a paid option. It's another pre-configured option to get performance over time. I mean, this is also great because it does synthetic and real user metrics, RUM, which we're going to dig into next here. So real user metrics is exactly what it says. These are metrics that your actual users are experiencing. This is gold. This is what we need to see because this is what's actually reflecting on the user's computers or their phones or whatever device they're using. So the best dashboards here, this is the best tools that I think I use when I look at real user metrics. First off is Google Crux Dashboard. This is an excellent tool. This Crux Dashboard gives me the exact data set Google themselves are using to determine performance for SEO rankings. The only downside here is if my site is newer or has low traffic, I'm not going to see the data here. And so I have an example report we can jump into here. We can see how this loads. This is the data that Google's taking a look at. So this is for, I believe this is for, harborfreight.com. We get the 3 core vitals here, and we can actually jump into each of these individually, and we can take a look at what Google's looking at us historically. So Harbor Freight has made some good improvements. Really good. Good to see. Good job, Harbor Freight. So great tool. This is the closest that you can get. If you're really concerned about SEO, well, this is what Google is saying your performance is looking like. The next tool is the Web Vitals Chrome extension. This is another free tool here. I have this hanging out over here. This is giving me on my browser what the performance is looking like as I kind of browse the internet. And so this is just my real user metrics. So I will sometimes load a website for the first time. I'll go incognito. I'll take a look at it in a different environment just so I can get a pulse check of myself. How is the performance looking like? So another extremely useful tool. The next thing is the Vercel Speed Insights. So this comes from a hosting provider, Vercel.com. This is free and paid. So if I'm hosting a site that's custom built in Next.js or React or some other framework, and I'm deploying it on Vercel, I have probably one of the best speed insights dashboards on the market right now. It tracks all the core vitals across all the site pages, and it ties them to code deployments. So when I push code to my repository, so I can see any regressions that come up. It's extremely comprehensive, real user metrics. It's got a really generous free offering to take advantage of as well. And if you want more sampling data points, you can of course like tap into that. But you see here, all the core vitals are here. We can see they have this real experience score that generally like above 90s are going to be really excellent. And then also we can track regression based on those deployments. And if you have lots of routes, we can track those here as well. On that spectrum of kind of getting more advanced, we have Datadog. This is a paid, very expensive tool, but it's very, very powerful for tracking real user metrics. You get lots of in-depth data. There's regression analysis tool. The downside is this does require a lot of instrumentation of code, so there needs a lot of coding knowledge just to get set up. But once you do have this set up, these are the tools that are used by some of the most mature, largest businesses on the market. So now that we know what is wrong with our site, how do we actually make the site faster? That's where the next step comes in. So step 2, knocking out easy wins in the site code. So now we know where our site stands in terms of performance. Let's actually dig into the code itself and see if you can improve anything. Think of this section as more of a checklist of things to review. These are the things that I kind of run through my mind when I'm looking at my site's performances. So for any site, I'm going to take a look at images and assets. Are they compressed? Are they optimized? Images are some of the largest reasons why site performance may be bad, as we're shipping extremely large images. So first of all, we're going to look and see if those are optimized. And so we're going to know this if our LCP metric is very high. I make sure my images are compressed. I usually use something like tinypng.com. If you just look up image compressor on Google, any one of those will do the job. And if possible, even more alpha, I try to use a WebP file format instead of PNG or JPEG, because it gives us even smaller sizes and better compression. The next thing is, am I hosting videos? So videos are a big deal, right? We usually like to have a nice flashy video for our homepages, but they take up a lot of space. So I'll use something like Handbrake. This is another tool that I like to use. I believe it's free. To compress down videos before I upload them to my site. So what I'm going to do is actually compress it again and again and again until I find the kind of local maximum of compression with the local minimum of video quality degradation. It takes some time, but it's a pretty easy process once you kind of set it up. Now for WordPress specifically, there's 2 things I like to look at: my plugins and my page builder. So why plugins? I want to review my plugins if there's anything extra I don't need. Plugins add a lot of bloat for maybe sometimes relatively simple functionality. If I'm a developer, I can actually code up what this plugin is doing and just rip it out of my site wholesale. The reason why that's important is that plugins can add tons of bloat to my website because they're written for like a broad audience, and I don't necessarily need every single feature that they're pushing. I just need this one specific thing. I'm going to grab that specific thing and just get rid of the plugin wholesale. And now my site is just shipping with less code. The less code I ship to my user, the less there is to download, the quicker the responses are, the faster the page is. And then why the page builder? There's Gutenberg, Cadence, GeneratePress, Divi, Elementor. Some page builders, to make it easier to develop the UI of a site, add in a ton of bloat to their software. Obviously they're going to do this because it takes code to wire in animations and layout grids and flex boxes. But the closer we are to bare metal, and I also think about this when I'm developing, the closer I am to the standard WordPress builder blocks, the less custom third-party code I'm loading to my site. Again, same kind of idea here. The less code I'm sending to my users, the quicker the site's going to be generally. And we have kind of a similar idea with Next.js or custom sites. Instead of plugins, we're going to look at the NPM packages. This is very similar. And so what I might even do is, if this is a super simple NPM package, I'm just going to go straight to that repo, copy paste it into my code base, and just get rid of the NPM package wholesale. Don't need it. Extra code, just get what I need. And now with Next.js 14 and 15, we can actually take advantage of more granular data fetching and caching those responses. And so this is also super useful if I'm having to call my CMS or a database or another upstream provider. I want to make sure I'm caching those calls so I'm not having to go over to my CMS to fetch some data every time. And then the next thing is, am I making too many data calls on the client side versus the server? So this is kind of a trend here of performance also is dependent on the things that the website needs to load. And a lot of those come from different third-party APIs. So I want to optimize where those APIs are being called. Think about it this way. if a user is in a very far location, it's going to take them, call it 450 milliseconds to reach that server. But the server is very close to the database. So that connection is only 30 milliseconds long. So I want to make sure all of my database calls are done on the server first before it gets sent over to the user. Because if the user has to do this round trip 2, 3, 4 times, now the site is taking 1, 2, 3 seconds to load, especially on slower devices like mobile phones. So step 3, that kind of is a good transition to going into reviewing hosting providers. So in general, I want to make sure that my hosting provider has fast servers and that we're using some form of a CDN. So CDN is going to help make sure my pages are automatically being cached and served extremely fast to my users. And so what this means is if my server has done all this work to fetch all the data from a database or maybe some other APIs, and I basically have this generated HTML, CSS, JavaScript, I want to store that all in a CDN where instead of 450 milliseconds, it takes maybe 200 milliseconds or 100 milliseconds because there's a CDN very, very close to the user and everything is pre-configured. So it feels like the page loads almost instantaneously. So I'm not going to go into detail here. There's a lot on hosting providers, but I'm going to make some callouts for hosting providers I've heard good things about. So for WordPress, I have a short list here. Known Host is kind of my favorite. It's got good caching. It's fast databases. There's WP Engine built by WordPress. They've got a built-in CDN as well. And there's HostGator. That's another good lower price option. Kind of an asterisk on HostGator. Feel like there's a lot of opinion on Reddit where this is maybe not so much a good choice for support reasons. But being someone technical, I think we can kind of smooth over a lot of those differences and take the lower price. If you're hosting Next.js, I think Vercel is best in class, of course. It's got the most comprehensive suite of infrastructure. It makes really, really fast sites, some of the fastest sites on the planet. I know OpenAI's website is hosted on Vercel. There's Netlify, Amplify, some of these other things exist, but kind of suffer from the same issues in that they're not up to date with Next.js. And so when Next.js has new features to introduce more granular caching, you're going to miss out on those. And you're missing out on those knobs and levers, which really help you eke out the most performance from your site. And so some general notes though, self-hosting in AWS is always an option and it gives you absolutely the most control. Obviously this requires extensive coding knowledge, but you can squeeze out the most performance hosting on your own infrastructure. And so if you really, really want to maximize performance, take that Next.js site, take that WordPress site, spin up your Docker containers, spin up your infrastructure, your load balancing, your caching, and of course you're going to get very hard to compete in terms of competitive performance. The next thing is layering on a CDN like Cloudflare, Akamai, or Fastly. Also a good option regardless of what hosting provider you're using. I want to make sure that my hosting provider, whatever I'm using, has some type of trusted proxy set up with my CDN provider. Otherwise, what's going to happen is for, let's say, like Known Host, if it just starts seeing a ton of requests come in from Cloudflare, even though you set it up, it's all coming from Cloudflare IP addresses. So they might want to say like, hey, this is actually a DDoS attack and just block traffic. So I want to make sure that they have some type of trusted proxy set up. That's probably the last call out here. So this is a ton of information. I hope you found it useful. If you want to dig into your specific site, head over to canogadigital.com and let's book some time to chat. But other than that, till next time, see ya.